Go on home, British soldiers, go on home. Have you got no fucking homes out the road?
Since the 1500s, Ireland has rebelled against England, and since the 1910s, the bulk of the conflict on the Irish side was handled by the Irish Republican Army. And Gaddafi's early life was plagued by negatives of colonialism. After World War II, when Gaddafi was around 3, British and French troops would occupy Libya. This would leave Gaddafi with a bitter hatred for England and other colonial states. Seeing the IRA struggle against England, Gaddafi's sympathy went with the Irish citizens fighting the British troops. Gaddafi admired the bravery of Joe Cahill speaking at a press conference in Belfast. The press conference would be held as British troops were patrolling right outside the building.
Obviously, the battle of the British Army hasn't been won. The losses in the IRA have been very slight, even in internment.
How many men of the provisionals and the IRA proper lost during the last week?
We have lost 30 men arrested, 2 killed and 8 wounded.
It was a huge slap in the face, given that the British Army was actually patrolling on the White Rock Road outside and didn't even know that this press conference was happening.
We had prior warning of this roundup. Consequently, we took the necessary precautions that there was nobody sleeping in their own homes or anything like that.
This signalled not only was the IRA alive and well, not only had the arrogance of the British been punctured, but that Republican Ireland had survived the heaviest punch the British could deliver and was coming back to punish the British for their arrogance and for the depredation they had done on us with internment.
You mean that they haven't even got near the leaders at all?
They haven't, no.
What's going to happen to you now? You've given this, attended this press conference.
Well, I'll have to go deeper underground. I'll have to go deeper underground.
Gaddafi believed Cahill was a man of honor that he could deal with, and specifically stated that he wanted to deal directly with Cahill above anyone else in the IRA. It is believed the first contact was made between Gaddafi and the IRA through Jan Golet in 1972. After Jan Golet established that Gaddafi wanted to speak with Cahill, Jack McCabe, the IRA quartermaster, and Cahill would go meet with Libyan representatives. Cahill would describe it as the following.
Jack McCabe, the IRA's Quartermaster General, and I eventually met him and we talked through an interpreter. The emissary told us that Gaddafi was very interested in the Irish question, would like to help, and would like to meet with me and whoever else came with me.
Nothing immediately came of this meeting, but the door was open, and in the background Gaddafi was working to find a way for Cahill and his men to covertly make a trip to Libya.
Go on home, British soldiers, go on home.
After the IRA decided it would be beneficial to go meet Gaddafi, the meeting was set. The IRA would form 2 small teams to make sure travel would be covert. One team would organize passports and travel plans. The other team was making the trip with Cahill. They would take a small private plane from Cork Airport in Ireland, and it would land in London. And from London, they would take a car to Rome, and from Rome they'd fly to Tripoli, Libya. The men would arrive in Tripoli without issue, and they were welcomed by Libyan officials. However, Gaddafi wasn't in the capital at the time, and the men spent around a week in Tripoli waiting for his return.
Go on home, British soldiers, go on home.
Cahill and his men were told to get ready. They were going to a military base to meet Gaddafi. When they'd get there, they would meet Gaddafi in the military headquarters. In this meeting, Gaddafi refused to speak English, despite being fluent. He would mention he was surprised that the IRA would use English at all, because it was the language of the colonists they were fighting against. Gaddafi would express his sympathies with the IRA and willingness to aid them financially and militarily. Cahill would explain to Gaddafi that they wouldn't accept any offers with strings attached, in which Gaddafi agreed. He wasn't interested in any favors from the IRA. He was offering full support without needing any reciprocation. But the fight against England in itself was beneficial to Gaddafi. Cahill would mention how impressed he was with Gaddafi's extensive knowledge of their fight against the British. And the meeting overall went well for both parties.
Go on home, British soldiers, go on home.
The Claudia was a cargo ship that was notorious internationally as a smuggling vessel, owned by a mysterious man only known as the German. The safest route for Cahill and his men to return to Ireland was to take the ship with the weaponry on board, 250 rifles, 246 bayonets, 850 rifle magazines, 243 pistols, more than 20,000 rounds of ammunition, 10 anti-tank mines, 500 high-explosive grenades, TNT explosive primers, Carter anti-tanks, electric fuses, and material for making booby traps. While traveling through the Mediterranean, they believed they had spotted a submarine, but they brushed it off as nothing. Cahill would explain,
I have no idea what the finer details were that lay behind the acquiring of the ship. What I do know is that we left it entirely up to the German. Our people had met the Libyans before I went out, and it was decided that a boat should be moored outside Libyan territorial waters and the stuff could be transported at sea. After I had met Gaddafi, we arranged that a radio signal from the Claudia, by this time just outside the limits, would let us know when to give the Libyans the go-ahead to head out to sea with the arms. When the people on board the Claudia could not make contact, they headed into Tripoli, which they should never have done. It was never intended that the boat would go into Tripoli. That was to be the safeguard for the Libyans, but the ship arrived in the harbour and there was a bit of a panic. The Libyans were fair enough. They said they would load the ship where it was. However, for reasons which I did not discover until years later, they did not supply all they said they were going to supply.
the boat would reach the Copper Coast, but due to the weather the men had to remain on the ship for another 24 hours, aggravating the IRA members and their men waiting in Helvik, at a safe house that overlooked the harbor awaiting their arrival. But like back in Libya, the radio signal from the Claudia wouldn't receive signal from the men in Helvik. On March 28th, they would spot the Claudia in the harbor. They would send out small boats to get the IRA men off the boat and deliver walkie-talkies so they had contact with the boat while they waited for the storm. Their plan was to dump the weapons into the water in fishing nets and have fishing boats drag them out to avoid any suspicion. When the coast was clear, the IRA men left on board would get on the small boat and return to shore. Believing the mission was a success, Joe Cahill was talking to two other men about how it went and how they pulled it off. While they were conversing about their success, they noticed 3 Irish Navy ships pulling up around the Claudia.
Amongst her first actions at sea, the Deirdre went into history when she stopped a gun-running attempt by the Claudia that had been carrying huge amounts of weapons and ammunition.
That submarine they had saw in the Mediterranean was in fact what they thought it was, and it shouldn't have been brushed off. The crew had a plan for this exact scenario. The ship was packed with explosives. They were supposed to abandon the ship and blow it up, sinking it before the authorities could capture it. However, being so close, they let their guard down. They weren't prepared and the Irish Navy ships were extremely fast. They contacted the men on shore and alerted them to the situation. The small boat they dispatched to bring the men to shore would attempt to flee, but the Navy ship would open fire. They'd attempt to keep fleeing, but a Navy rubber dinghy boat would outpace them and fire 2 shots into their small boat, where they were forced to stop. The men on shore were fleeing to safe houses away from the scene. The Navy and the Guardians of Peace seemingly knew what was already going on. They'd placed a tank outside of Murray's bar, where some of the IRA men had been hiding while a party was going on. The team that was heading to pick up the weapons, unknowing what happened, would be stopped at a military checkpoint. But they managed to get through without issue, saying they were on their way to pick up food from a co-op. The Navy had sent out divers to see if they could recover what they had been throwing over, but came up with nothing. A fisherman in the vicinity had seen where it was being thrown over, and he was able to recover the items. But it wasn't weapons. It was 2 suitcases with around $50,000 in cash, with the forged passports that IRA men had used on their trip to Tripoli. Along with the money and passports, it had a statue of the Arc de Triomphe and a custom knife that Gaddafi had gifted Joe Cahill, some clothes, and a list of contacts. The Claudia would be seized by the Navy and searched, but it would be cleared and released.
Go on home, British soldiers, go on home.
Joe Cahill, Sean Garvey, Jerry Murphy, Gur Walsh, Dolan Wellen, and Dennis McInnery would all be arrested for the incident with the Claudia. The fishermen that had found the suitcases, according to authorities, didn't have connections with the IRA, but had used the names in the contact list to give the suitcase back to the IRA 3 weeks later. On May 21st, 1973, Joe Cahill would be sentenced to 3 years in prison Dennis McInnery and Sean Garvey would be sentenced to 2 years. Dolan Wellen and Jerry Murphy would receive a 2-year suspended sentence, and Ger Walsh was acquitted. Outside of the courthouse, Joe Cahill would give a speech and say the following:
All my life I have believed passionately in the freedom of my country. I believe it is the God-given right of the people of Ireland to determine their own destinies without foreign interference and, in pursuit of these aims and ideals, it is my proud privilege as a soldier of the Irish Republican Army, just as I believe it is the duty of every Irish person, to serve or assist the IRA in driving the British occupation forces from our shores. If I am guilty of any crime, it is that I did not succeed in getting the contents of the Claudia into the hands of the freedom fighters in this country. And I believe that national treachery was committed off Helvic when the Free State forces conspired with our British enemies to deprive our freedom fighters of the weapons of war.